Well, good afternoon. I just want to thank the choir for their ministry to us today. I also want to add my prayers to Pastor Milliken and his wife and the others who are going off to Nepal. It's a wonderful mission they're doing there. Let's continue to keep them in our prayers. There's different ways to do mission, of course, isn't there? And I want to also take the opportunity to mention again that there is a meeting this afternoon at 4:30 in the sanctuary here for all those who are interested in being involved in the Vaughan Church plant. That too is mission. We're reaching out to a new community, and it's not the same distance of travel, but it also involves sacrifice and time. And we want to encourage anyone who would like to be involved in that to come out, and we'll get down to business. And so, by all means, if you want to be part of that, come here this afternoon, 4:30 sharp, and we'll begin. There was a conference in Britain a number of years ago that was looking at, comparative religions, and one of the seminars in that conference was looking at, asking the question, what is distinctive about Christianity? Is there anything that's unique to Christianity alone? And they began to compare notes, and one suggested one thing, one another. For example, some said, what about the incarnation? But others says, in certain other religions, ancient religions, there was the idea that the gods would become flesh. They would become born into human form, at least. Others said, what about the resurrection? Well, other religions talked about the idea of a dying and rising God, at least in some form. So they discussed these things back and forth, and we're not coming to any clear conclusion. But this was a number of years ago, and then it was that C.S. Lewis walked into the room in his typical British fashion, says, "What's all the rumpus about?" And when he found out what the question they were discussing was, he said, that's easy. It's grace. After some discussion, the conference attenders had to agree. The notion that God's love comes to us free of charge, no strings attached, seems to go against every instinct of humanity. The Buddhists have their eightfold path. The Hindus, their doctrine of karma. The Jewish have their covenant. The Muslims, their code of law. Each of these can offer a way to gain approval from their respective gods. Only Christianity dares to make God's love unconditional. So what is grace? A bloodless definition might be, unmerited favor, but that doesn't tell us a whole lot, and it's hard to get your heart into that, isn't it? We have the word grace in English in many forms. We say a person who has been told they have to leave the country, they are a persona non grata, a person without grace. We say grace at the end of the meal, thanking God for his favor and giving us food that we didn't deserve or earn, right? We say the person who treats another person with kindness is gracious. We have grace appear in many forms in the English language. But the best way of defining it maybe is through seeing it in action. So I have several stories I want to share with you today that illustrate, if you will, grace. You've probably heard of Jesus' parable, no doubt, about the man who was he organized a banquet, and he invited people to come. When it came time for the banquet, people says, not interested, I'm too busy, I'm doing this, that, whatever. They didn't come. So what did he do? He sent messengers out to the highways and byways and encouraged them, compelled them to come in. He wanted to show them grace, to give them what they did not expect, what they did not deserve. He gave it to them freely because of who he was. I want to tell you a modern day version, a true story, happened reported in the Boston Globe in 1990. And what happened is a woman accompanied by her fiancé went to the Hyatt Hotel in Boston and ordered a meal. And they looked over the books together and they said, we want these silverware, we want these dishes, we want these flowers, we want this food. And they had expensive tastes. This was 1990, remember. Expensive tastes, and the bill for just the meal at the Hyatt came to $13,000. Well, they had to leave, as part of the contract, leave a check for half the amount. And then they went home to look at wedding invitations, to go through all the business of a wedding. Well, the day the announcements were meant to hit the mailboxes, the groom got cold feet. And he said to his bride-to-be, he says, "You know what, this is a big decision. I don't know if we're ready for it. Shall we give it some more time to consider?" Well, she was devastated, as you can imagine, and angry. And so she went around trying to undo the damage and get their money back from all the deposits and down payments. She went to the hotel, and they said, and the events coordinator said to her, "Look, I'm sorry, honey, you know what? I'd love to give this back to you, but the contract is binding. I can't get out of it. You know, the corporation won't let me. The most I can give you under the terms of the contract is 10% of the total contract. I can give back a check for $1,300. Unless you want to go through with it in some way, that's all we can do." Well, that was a novel idea. So she thought about that for a day or so, and she came back and says, "You know what? I want to go through with it." Now imagine a wedding banquet without a wedding couple. No groom. So she had to make some changes to what they were ordering, of course, to reflect the new circumstances, and that's what she did. And so she decided, for example, to change the menu. And so she changed out the main course to boneless chicken, she said, in honor of the groom, you see. And instead of the regular roster of guests, she invited to the wedding instead people from a local homeless shelter, people from a rescue mission, people from people who were living on the streets, people who had addicts from a local clinic. So she called all these people and she set it up so they could come and take part in this wedding, and that's what happened. So back in June of 1990, the Hyatt Hotel in downtown Boston hosted a party like nothing they'd seen before. That warm summer night, the maitre d's and ushers dressed in tuxedos took around hors d'oeuvres to bag ladies and addicts, homeless people, shared with them something they'd never had before and probably would never have again. Bag ladies and vagrants and addicts dined on, chicken cordon bleu and truffles and all sorts of other things that they'd never had before, instead of scraping, old pizza off of cardboard boxes from dumpsters. And that night, those homeless people and addicts took the night off from the very difficult, harsh night on the streets. Instead, they danced to big band tunes through the night. That's grace. Giving extravagantly to those who could not return the favor because she wanted to. Let me tell you another story. A young girl grows up on a cherry orchard near Traverse City, Michigan. Her parents are somewhat old-fashioned, so they tend to overreact to her nose ring, the music she listens to, the length or breadth of her skirts. And they ground her a few times, and she sees inside. "I hate you," she screams to her father one day. And when he tries to make amends and meet with her afterwards. And so she acts that night on a plan that she's been rehearsing for some time. She packs a bag and she leaves. She runs away. Where will she go? Well, you might think that she might go to Florida or to California, right? Easier life there, warmer. But she decides to go to a place where she thinks her parents will never look for her. She decides to go to Detroit. And so she arrives there, and she gets there, and of course this is a dangerous city, and she figures her parents will never look for her there because, after all, the story she's heard from Traverse City is all about the gang violence, the drugs, the crime. So she knows they won't expect her to go there. Well, the second day she's there, she runs into a man who, he drives the biggest car she's ever seen. And he offers her a ride, buys her lunch, arranges for her to have a place to stay. He gives her some pills that actually make her feel better than she's ever felt before. He makes her feel better than she looks at this and says, "This is fantastic. My parents had it all wrong. This is fun. This is life." The good life continues for a month, 2 months, year. And the man with the big car, she now calls him boss, teaches her a few things that men like, and since she's underage, men will pay a premium for her. She lives in a penthouse and can order room service whenever she likes. And she thinks now, looking back, how provincial, how boring her life was before this. She has a brief scare one day when she sees her face on the back of a milk carton that says, "Have you seen this child?" But by now, with her bleached blonde hair, her piercings, and everything else, well, you wouldn't recognize her as the same girl. And when you're in Detroit, nobody's going to tell on you either. Well, after a year or so, the first sallow signs of illness appear, and it amazes her how mean the boss turns, how quickly. And she soon finds herself out on the street without a penny to her name. She has to still turn a few tricks every night just to get by, to get enough food to feed herself and to support her now drug habit. It's winter time now, and she's sleeping on a grate outside of a department store, pulled some newspapers over herself to try to get some warmth. And she begins to cry. You can't sleep very well, of course. You have to watch for every stranger that goes by. You don't know what someone might do to you on the streets of Detroit. And she begins at one time, what comes into her mind is an image of life in Traverse City, of cherry blossoms in the middle of summertime or in springtime, and going through the trees with her dog, playing ball, just enjoying the family life back home. And she says to herself, God, what have I done? What have I done? Pain shoots through her. And she says, my dog at home lives better than I do, has better food than I do. And she knows that more than anything else in the world, she wants to go home. Why did I leave? So she gets up the courage and she makes a phone call. She gets an answering machine, hangs up. Calls again, no answer, hangs up. Calls a third time. This time she decides to leave a message. She says, Dad, Mom, it's me. I'm thinking of maybe coming home. I'm catching a bus up your way, and I'll get there about midnight tomorrow. If you're not there at the bus station, I'll just continue on up to Canada. She leaves it at that. It takes about 7 hours for the bus to make all the stops from Michigan, from Detroit, all the way up to Traverse City. And during that time, she realizes the flaws in her plan, because what if her parents aren't even home? Maybe they've gone away for a few days and they'll never get the message, right? Maybe she should have waited another day at least till she talked to them before she came home. Try to gauge a sense of their reaction. They're probably in shock if they even heard the message. And maybe they just gave up on her a long time ago. Her thoughts bounce back and forth, as she thinks about the speech that she has rehearsed for her father. Dad, it's not your fault, it's all mine. Can you forgive me? She goes over and over the words in her mind. She hasn't apologized to anybody in years. Well, the bus has been driving with its lights on since Bay City, and she can see the snow, coming against the windshield in a dark night, and she forgot how dark it gets up there. At one point, the bus swerves to avoid a deer, which darts across the road. Every so often, there's a billboard with the miles marked out to Traverse City. Oh God, she says, I'm so scared. When the bus finally rolls into the station, air brakes hiss in protest. The driver announces on those crackly, intercom system, 15 minutes, that's all we have here. 15 minutes to decide her life. She checks her face in a compact mirror. She licks the lipstick off her teeth and notices the tobacco stains on her fingers and wondering if her parents will notice, if they're even there. So she walks into the terminal, not knowing what to expect. And not one of the thousand scenes that have played out in her mind prepare her for what she sees. There, in the concrete walls and plastic chairs of the Traverse City bus terminal, stands a group of 40 brothers and sisters and great aunts and uncles and cousins and a grandmother and a great-grandmother to boot. They're all wearing goofy party hats and blowing noisemakers, and taped across the entire wall of the terminal is a computer-generated banner that reads, "Welcome home." Out of a crowd of well-wishers breaks her dad. She stares out through the tears in her eyes and begins a memorized speech. "Dad, I'm sorry. I know," but he interrupts her. "Hush, child, there's no time for that. No time for apologies. You'll be late for the party. A banquet's waiting for you at home." You recognize the story? Yeah. Retelling of the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15. What is the point of the story? Matter of fact, it's really not about the son at all. Because the point of that story and the other two found in that same chapter are all about the Father's love. Those stories are actually telling us the heart and mind of God towards us. That his love for us is unconditional. Every one of those stories ends the same way, with a party, a celebration, because it's telling us what the Father feels in his heart when we come back to him. The fact that his love for us never diminishes, never changes. That parable of the prodigal son finishes by these words, "Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this my son was dead and is alive. He was lost and he is found." This is what it's like to be God, says Jesus. This is what our Father feels. This is how happy it makes him when we find our way home. The prodigal son, though, is the favorite of those three parables, isn't it? For most people, I think. Why? Well, mainly, I think, because of the demonstration of God's grace. No matter what the son had done to the father, all was forgiven. All that mattered to the father was getting his son back. His love was truly unconditional. So maybe we can define grace this way, and I take this definition from Philip Yancey's book, What's So Amazing About Grace? And if you haven't read that book before, you should. This is his definition. There is nothing we can do to make God love us anymore. And there's nothing we can do to make God love us any less. Let me repeat that. There's nothing we can do to make God love us anymore. No amount of rule keeping, spiritual exercises, good deeds, Bible study, service in the church, donations to the church. Nothing can decrease or increase God's love for us. Nothing you can do can make God's love any less. No amount of pride, pornography, adultery, murder, nothing can destroy God's love for you and for me. What makes that very hard to accept is that our life experience is so different in this world. We're used to earning our way. You get nothing for free in this world, after all. Isn't that the case? You get what you pay for. No such thing as a free lunch. No pain, no gain. Right? We live by that logic. There is little room for grace. Think of the institutions that you deal with, whether it's schools, corporations, the military, sports franchises. It's all based on the principle, if I can use that ironically, the principle of ungrace. There are rules, evaluations, rewards, punishments. You get what you earned, rewarded if you succeed, punished if you fail. You're slotted, you're categorized. That's life, isn't it? Some societies have ungrace down to an art form. In South Africa, during the time of apartheid, a very rigid social system, everyone was slotted into one of 4 different racial categories: white, black, colored, Asian. And then when the Japanese began to do business with them, they said they needed a new category, so they gave them the title of honorary white people. Yeah. They developed subgroups, subcategories. So a person who was 1/8 black was called an octoroon. Think of India. The time of Gandhi, before, still in some places in India today, there's a rigid caste system. You had, of course, you've all heard of the untouchables. The lowest caste defiled others simply by touching them. And it was hereditary. You got that way not because of something you'd done wrong, but because karma had made you that way, because of what you'd done in a previous life meant that you deserved to be where you were. And so you had to stay where you were for the rest of your life. That was just the way it is. After 200 years of British rule, the British discovered another class that never knew existed before, lower than the untouchables. They were the invisibles. And they contaminated people by simply being seen by them. And they crept out at night to clean the latrines of the untouchables. In our world, we are used to being measured and found wanting. Grace is not part of the equation. And unfortunately, this attitude infects Christians all too often. Sometimes we fall into the same trap of accepting the world's definition of acceptance and grace. We debate doctrine, we trumpet truth, but are sometimes poor at demonstrating grace to a world that is hungry for it. We can be just as condemning and unaccepting as the world around us. We've all done it before. So instead of modeling the grace of Christ, we excel at finding fault and criticizing others. It's our natural default position. It's easy to do, comes naturally. There is judgment without love. We can find ourselves radiating moral superiority without recognizing our own poverty of spirit. Mark Twain, he has lots of wonderful quotes, He's very readable. But he talked of people, and I quote, who were good in the worst sense of the word. Right? We know people like that. Now, are morals and truth unimportant? Are they? Well, of course they're important. But unless they are communicated and lived in an atmosphere of grace, they become destructive. That was the difference between Christ and the Pharisees. The common people wanted to be around Jesus. They just loved to be in his presence. He was perfect, and yet they loved to be around him. What did that say about the way he communicated his righteousness? They hung on his words. They felt love being around him. The Pharisees scared people away. People felt condemned in their presence. They could tell you all the things you were doing and wrong in detail. But who wants to be around people who make you feel rotten? Is it an enjoyable experience? Don't think so. So the question you each have to ask ourselves is, what are we known for? How are we perceived by those around us as we communicate truth, morality, our values as people, their worth? I asked this morning, got very few people who admitted this, but how many people know the old, it's been around for decades. I don't know if it's around now, but the children's program Romper Room, is it still on today in reruns? Or do you know what that program is? Anyone? No? A few people? Yeah, some people show that with embarrassment. I think it's because it is such an old program, It's like confessing your age or something like that. Well, years ago, and this is decades ago, before it was politically incorrect to talk about religion and so forth, they would invite children as guests onto the program, and the person who was the host of the program would put the mic to their, to them and ask them questions. So where are you from? What's your name? And where do you go to church? Can you imagine that happening today, asking where people go to church? And where do you go to church? And one child one time was an Adventist. Where do you go to church? I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. Oh, I haven't heard of that before. What do you believe? Now, what would you hope they would say to a question like that? Well, I believe that Jesus died for my sins and that he's coming one day soon to take me home. You could think of maybe a number of good answers to that. But this child says, are you ready? I don't eat pork and we hate Catholics. On national television, yeah. Where on earth did they get that summary of our faith? A little child? Ungrace, don't you think? Yeah. In contrast to that, you have a picture of the church, the beginning church, the new church, the church that Jesus founded, the church that was nourished and strengthened and empowered by the Holy Spirit after Pentecost. Open your Bibles, if you have them there, to Acts chapter 2. I want to give you this picture here of the church. Acts chapter 2. Starting at verse 42. Here's this picture, if you will, of a gracious, loving church. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and miraculous signs were done by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. Selling their possessions and goods they gave to anyone as he had need, and every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. Now let me just pause there for a moment. The favor of all the people. Are we talking about people in the church? They enjoyed the favor of all the people. People outside the church says, I may not agree with what they teach. I may not accept their Messiah as the Messiah from God, but the way they love each other, the way they care for each other, the way they simply show love, the acceptance they show, they're incredible people. I would love to be part of that group. I'd love to be part of that community of believers. In fact, it says there, the result of that kind of spirit that was in their midst, that sort of attractive, magnetic fellowship, the result of that was that, at the end of the verse, and the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Daily people were coming in because they wanted to be there, because they didn't want to be anywhere else. The power of the magnetic fellowship of loving people who were dealt with each other with incredible grace. People wanted to be part of it. That was their mission. That was so much how they grew. They just saw the love that was in the midst of these people as they cared for each other. And by the way, it's also how the church grew in ancient times. Roman writers, we have many of their writings, and they wrote to each other sometimes, and they were persecuting the church. And one of the things that made it difficult to persecute the church was that the Christians were not only taking care of their own people, but they were also taking care of their neighbors, the pagans around them. They were showing them love. They were taking care of them in difficult times and plague times, and doing very practical acts of service for their neighbors. And so Roman writer sometimes says, they're winning people because they're showing all this love and respect for other people. We should be doing that too, so that the church doesn't get so many people. So they said, we got to compete with them by showing love. It didn't work, of course. But the church continued to grow. Our first task as Christians is to live God's love in the world so that people will be drawn to Him. We have to model grace. The primary weapon of grace, if I can put it that way, the primary weapon of grace is forgiveness. It is an absolutely essential quality of real Christianity. It's also much easier to talk about than it is to do. The human tendency is to nurse sores, rationalize our behavior, perpetuate family feuds, punish ourselves, punish others, all to avoid this unnatural act. I can contrive 100 reasons against forgiveness, against showing grace. He needs to learn a lesson. Right? I don't want to encourage irresponsible behavior. I'll let her stew for a while, do her good. Right? She needs to learn that her actions have consequences. I was the wrong party. Why should I be the one to give forgiveness? Why should I make the first move? How can I forgive when he's not even sorry? Sound familiar? And what we do as individuals plays out in the histories of peoples. Ireland, for decades, was fighting back and forth, divided, killing each other over atrocities that Oliver Cromwell did back in the 17th century. Rwanda and Burundi, mass murder going back because of long tribal memories, beyond people's memories. Yugoslavia, of course, divided. People fought each other, avenging atrocities from World War II and beyond. Iraq, well, tribal memory is a long thing. Religious history, tribal history separates, continued the feuds, tearing it apart still today. Ungrace, an inability to forgive, plays in the background of families and nations and in churches. But forgiveness indeed is possible through God's grace. That's what it's all about. His great power to break the cycles of ungrace. First, grace has power. It releases us personally from anger and bitterness. It heals us. Remember reading about an immigrant rabbi, and he delayed coming over to America after World War II, after the Holocaust. He took his time getting here, and he was interviewed. He said, "Why did you take so long? You had free passage, a place to stay. Why did it take you so long to decide to come to America?" And he said, "Before coming to America, I had to forgive Adolf Hitler because I did not want to bring Hitler inside me to my new country." Isn't that interesting? I didn't want to bring Hitler inside me to my new country, because forgiveness sets us free. We are healed when we forgive someone else. Otherwise, our pain and anger and frustration gets passed on, bequeathed, if you will, to the next generation. Philip Yancey, in that same book I mentioned, What's So Amazing About Grace, that's my second plug for that one, he tells of a friend of his named George, and his marriage was falling apart. George was to the breaking point. At one time, George recounts how he was pounding the table and screamed at his wife, "I hate you. I won't take it anymore. I've had enough. I won't go on like this. I won't let it happen. No, no, no," as he pounded the table. But several months later, George woke up in the middle of the night, and he heard strange sounds coming from down the hallway in his son's room. And so he padded quietly down the hallway and listened at the door. And there he found his 2-year-old son repeating word for word, with precise inflection, the argument that his wife and he had had just weeks before. "I hate you. I won't take it anymore. No, no, no." Forgiveness breaks this cycle. It is powerful. Second, forgiveness has the power to transform other people. You've all heard of the Ku Klux Klan before. A number of years ago, it made big news back in 1992. The Grand Dragon of the KKK from Lincoln, Nebraska, his name was Larry Trapp, made national headlines because in that year he renounced his hatred, tore down his Nazi flags, and destroyed his many boxes full of hate literature. Catherine Waterton recounts in a book that she wrote called Not by the Sword, she describes the story. And she said how Trapp had been won over by the forgiving love of a Jewish cantor and his family. Though Trapp had sent them vile pamphlets, mocking big-nosed Jews and denying the Holocaust, though he had threatened violence in phone calls, and though he had targeted their synagogue for firebombing, the Jewish cantor and his wife had responded consistently with compassion, love, forgiveness, grace, concern. You see, this man, this Grand Dragon, Larry Trapp, was a long-time diabetic. And as he got older, he began to lose his abilities. He was confined to a wheelchair. He began to go blind. And the amazing thing is, this Jewish cantor and his family took him into their home, nursed him, and took care of him until he died. they showed him such powerful love that he could not hold on to his hatred anymore. He finally renounced all his ideas. He renounced his hatreds. He asked their forgiveness, and he wrote letters to all the people that he had hurt by his hatred that he held in his heart. Big news, national news. I wish I knew how the other members of the KKK, how they reacted to his change in heart. You see, grace has the power to transform other people as well as ourselves. A lot of stories. I want to share one last story with you. This happened in 1987, Ireland. The IRA went into a small town west of Belfast amid a group of Protestants that were celebrating, or remembering rather, the war dead on Veterans Day. They blew up a bomb. 11 people were killed and 63 others were wounded. What made this act of terrorism stand out from so many others was the response of one of the wounded, whose name was Gordon Wilson. He was a devout Methodist who had emigrated from the Irish Republic to move to the north and to work there as a draper. The bomb buried Wilson and his 20-year-old daughter under 5 feet of concrete and brick. "Daddy, I love you very much," were the last words Marie spoke. She slipped into unconsciousness and died as she held her father's hand under the rubble while they waited for the rescuers to come. A newspaper later proclaimed this, and I quote, "No one remembers what the politicians had to say at that time, but no one who heard Gordon Wilson will ever forget what he confessed. His grace towered over the miserable justifications of the bombers. Speaking from his hospital bed, Wilson said, 'I have lost my daughter, but I bear no grudge. Bitter talk is not going to bring back Marie Wilson to life. I shall pray tonight and every night that God will forgive them.' His daughter's last words were words of love, and Gordon Wilson determined to live out his life on that plane of love. The world wept," said one report as Wilson gave a similar interview on the BBC. After his release from his hospital, Gordon Wilson led a crusade for Protestant Catholic Reformation, or rather restoration, reconciliation in Northern Ireland. Protestant extremists who had planned to avenge the bombing decided that it was politically, not very wise to, at that point, look for, revenge, so they called it off. Wilson wrote a book about his daughter, speaking against violence, and constantly repeated the refrain, "Love is the bottom line." He met with the IRA, personally forgave them, and asked them to lay down their arms. "I know that you've all lost loved ones," he said to them. "Surely enough is enough. Enough blood has been spilled." The Irish Republic ultimately made Wilson a member of the Senate, and Great Britain continued to honor this ordinary Christian citizen who had gained fame for his uncommon spirit of grace and forgiveness. Do you think you could do that, what he did? That is the power of forgiveness in a grace-filled life. And that is a call that Jesus gives to each one of us. If we have experienced grace, we must live it, or our Christianity is worth precisely nothing. In the supreme act of grace, Jesus died on the cross so that we could enjoy forgiveness leading to eternal life. And he calls on you and me to be agents of grace where we are. Agents of grace to our families, in this church, and in the world. We are called to live the difference, to show people what it means to be a follower of Jesus, to let people know that Jesus is alive because they can see him lived out in our lives. The challenge to us is how we respond. We come to him as we are. He gives us grace. Is it real enough that it changes the way we deal with one another? Does it change the way we deal with the person who is miserable? Does it change the way we deal with our families, our friends, our coworkers, our people at school, at work? Are we agents of grace because that is our calling? How we respond is up to us, up to you, up to me. The choice is ours. Jesus gives us the power to do what we could not do otherwise. Let's seek that power, and he will transform us and transform the world through us. Amen.